What does the word medieval mean to you? In today's world, it means all sorts of things. Sometimes it's old-fashioned, outdated, ignorant, or even cruel.
This president's medieval vanity project called a wall.
At other times, it evokes ideas of honor, romance, chivalry, or even fantasy. For me, as a medievalist, it's a period of time, the Middle Ages, a period of about 1,000 years, which was the focus of my studies in university. A period that I found so fascinating that I went and got a master's degree in medieval studies and eventually created a YouTube channel which I've devoted, for the most part, to it. But what are the Middle Ages? When are they? Why middle? It might surprise you how imprecise the answers to some of these questions really are. Whenever someone asks me, what is medieval history, or when were the Middle Ages, my quick response is usually a period of around 1,000 years from about 500 to 1500. I'm definitely not the only person who would answer this way, and in fact, I've seen this exact answer used by other medievalists. But obviously, if at least by the fact that this video isn't over yet, there's a little bit more to it than that. A more involved response might be that it's a period of history, largely European history, between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. This also has its limits, but it does let me talk a little bit about the name. The term Middle Ages comes from a long-standing tradition of dividing history into three parts: antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the modern period. The Middle Ages is middle in that it came between the other two. This three-part division seems to have first been used in 1442 by the Florentine historian Leonardo Bruni in his History of the Florentine People. Bruni was building off of an earlier concept which saw antiquity as a fantastical golden age which ended with the fall of Rome, and was followed by a time of stagnation and decline. Bruni, however, saw the prosperity of Florence in his own time, the early Renaissance, as, well, just that, a renaissance, a rebirth of that glory which had existed in antiquity. This is why the period from the Renaissance to around 1800 is referred to as the early modern period, to contrast it from our own contemporary modernity. For some people, it might seem a little strange to refer to Shakespeare and Louis XIV as modern, but hey, we have Bruni to blame for that. Many languages use their own words for Middle Age to describe the period. In French, for example, you have Moyen Âge, and in German, it's Mittelalter. The adjective medieval comes from the Latin term medium aevum, which means, you guessed it, Middle Age. This is why sometimes, especially in the UK, you'll see it spelt like this, with an AE. But I'd argue that there's nothing more medieval than collapsing AE diphthongs into E's. If you know what I'm talking about, chances are you've studied medieval Latin. Interestingly, the term is first attested in 1604. Bruni himself didn't call it that, but it became the favorite over time. One of those alternate terms is still used today, though more in popular culture than by historians, and that is the Dark Age. The concept of the Dark Age is usually attributed to Petrarch, who described his own age as a time of darkness, in contrast to the light of antiquity. His time was, according to him, a time of ignorance, error, and backwardness, whereas the era of light, antiquity, was one of wisdom, knowledge, and truth. Petrarch subscribed to a golden age ideology. Things were better back in the day. Men were men, people cared about virtue and truth. I'm sure you've heard this all before. It's a tale as old as time. And it's this idea of a dark age that Bruni and others played off of in the Renaissance. They saw things as pretty great in their own time, so they assumed there must have been a rebirth. Any lingering issues they had could be blamed on the long stagnation of the Dark Age, while antiquity was placed on a pedestal as a utopian ideal. Now, you may have heard that the term Dark Ages actually refers to the relative lack of sources, especially in the early Middle Ages, and that is how some have used it in more recent times, but the original meaning was pejorative. Petrarch looked at his own time negatively, and this was reinforced especially in the Enlightenment era of the 17th and 18th centuries, when thinkers who were critical of the church and some of religion generally used the Dark Ages as proof that the church ruined civilization, and it was reason which brought them back to the light. And this idea is still quite present at the popular level today. But if you've watched any of my videos before, hopefully you've got the notion that reality was a little bit more complicated than that. For most people, living in the Middle Ages was no more dark than living in antiquity. And even if you're glad that you don't live in the Middle Ages, which honestly, so am I, using pejorative terms like Dark Ages can bring bias for both historians and their readers. And because of this, most historians, especially medievalists, have dropped the term in favor of others that are available. Okay, so let's get back on track. When did the Middle Ages start? Well, like I said before, the easy answer is the fall of Rome. And the date usually given for that, including by Bruni, is 476. This is the year when the Gothic general Odoacer overthrew the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus and declared himself king of Italy. This is a great date to choose and probably the most widely used. But even here, things aren't so simple. For one, this moment saw the end of the Western Roman Empire, but the Eastern Empire continued to exist throughout the Middle Ages, lasting until 1453, 9 years after Bruni's death. After the fall of the Western Empire, it's often referred to as the Byzantine Empire in order to differentiate it from the ancient Roman Empire. But the whole reason why people started doing that is because of this arbitrary division of eras. The Byzantines always called themselves the Roman Empire, and the term Byzantine Empire was first used in the early modern period. Nobody woke up in 476 and said, "Hey, it's the Middle Ages now," especially not in the Eastern Empire. In fact, Odoacer had originally submitted to the Eastern Emperor Zeno as a vassal. This isn't to say, though, that nothing changed. Things definitely did. But to pinpoint an exact date where a switch was flipped, changing one era for the next, is always going to be imprecise. The truth is, some things changed, while others stayed the same for a long time. Depending on who you ask, certain changes might be seen as more important for deciding when the Middle Ages began. For a historian of philosophy, it might be with the death of Boethius in 524, who's often considered one of the last classical thinkers. On the other hand, I once met a church historian who saw the Council of Nicaea in 325 as the major turning point, since it really created the church as an institution, though most probably wouldn't push that far back. Historians will often use the term late antiquity to refer to a period that covers the end of classical antiquity, but extends beyond 476. When late antiquity begins and ends, though, is also not clear-cut, and this is largely on purpose. In some uses, it can go as far as the year 600, sometimes even a bit further, and it reflects the continuation in the centuries immediately after the fall of the Western Empire of institutions and ideas with those before the fall. And indeed, the year 500 had a lot more in common with the year 400 than either did with the years 200 or 800. In the aftermath of the fall, so-called barbarian kings continued to act as they had before, adopting Roman customs and culture, and maintaining many Roman institutions. Classical literature and ideas also remained important. I would say then that late antiquity was a transitionary period between antiquity and the Middle Ages. Parts of it were both antique and medieval at the same time. The situation is similar with the end of the Middle Ages and the start of modernity, except here there's even less agreement on any specific date. Some will say 1453, the year Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, and thus the end of the Byzantine Empire. Others say 1492, when Columbus sailed to the Americas. Others still say 1517, with the start of the Protestant Reformation. Again, it depends on who you ask and what they find important. For a lot of people, the Renaissance is seen as the end of the Middle Ages, but even when the Renaissance started is up for debate. For some focused on humanist ideas, they might say it started with Petrarch in the early 1300s. Those focused on Renaissance art might say that it's more the mid-1400s. And same thing for those who draw attention to the invention of the printing press, which honestly I think was probably the biggest game changer. But you could just as well argue that all of these times were also very connected to the medieval world as well. I don't think a single medievalist, or even early modernist for that matter, would say that Petrarch's world was anything but medieval. And even in the case of the printing press, it took a while for that same tech to really have its impact felt. So, similarly to late antiquity, the Renaissance can be seen as a transitionary time between medieval and modern, being at times, and in different aspects, both at once. The boundaries of the Middle Ages are fuzzy gradients, not solid lines. Now, something else to keep in mind when talking about what the Middle Ages were is that this is a period that lasted for about 1,000 years. 1,000 years is a long time. Honestly, way too long to be grouping in as a single era, because things changed over time. And because of this, it's often subdivided. What these divisions are, again, depends on who you ask. In English scholarship, it's usually between the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and the Late Middle Ages. And this is by and large what I use. As you can probably guess by now, the date of transition from one to the other will depend on who you ask, and precise dates are rarely perfect. Someone focused on England will likely use 1066 as the start of the High Middle Ages, because of the Norman Conquest, while someone focused on France might use 987, the start of the Capetian dynasty. The division between high and late is often more fuzzy, and not everyone makes the distinction. I'll often group them together as the later Middle Ages when contrasting them to something early medieval. Generally, though, the date chosen is around 1300, and some see the late Middle Ages as more or less synonymous with the early Renaissance, at least in places like Italy. Now, in global history, you might hear the term medieval used outside the context of Europe. In this case, the medieval era for, say, Japan, won't really fit with these dates. In the case of Japan, it usually refers to the period from the beginning of the shogunate in the 1100s to the start of the Edo period in 1600. Obviously, events specific to Europe aren't going to bring drastic change to the whole world. Well, not until a bit later anyway. So, to assume the Middle Ages would be the same for everyone would be wrong. The merits of the use of the term medieval in any other context could be debated, but by and large, when it is used, it's meant to say that this is a distinct period which took place roughly around the same time as the European Middle Ages. There may be connections, especially when we're talking about a history which was close to and interacted with medieval Europe, like the Islamic world, but we shouldn't assume that what was true in medieval Europe was always true elsewhere. So, what and when were the Middle Ages? Well, it depends on who you ask and what medieval means to you. It's the middle period between classical antiquity and modernity, though, of course, that only really means anything if you know what those are. That's why I usually default to saying roughly 500 to 1500. In the end, although periodization is a valuable tool for grouping together events and trends in history, it's always going to be applied imperfectly and almost always retroactively. It helps us decide what our focus is going to be, but talking about 476 without understanding what came before would be a little bit silly. I hope you enjoyed this slightly more theoretical video. I think that talking about historiographical stuff like this is equally as important for a channel dedicated to history as any other topic. As usual, I thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.